The film you're about to see should never have been taken at all. When we went into East Bengal and through into Burma, an army order came out that no cameras must be taken. I was a young officer in my early 20s, a keen photographer, and I had a movie camera, 16mm, in the bottom of my kit bag, and I didn't see why I shouldn't take some photographs. What I didn't realize was that the film would soon deteriorate in the heat and the humidity, and I got them taken back to Calcutta eventually, which was 600 miles away, and stored. In 1945, the censors walked in, and I was in great trouble and really court-martialed. Many people of influence here helped, and the regiment as well, and said, well, take out what offends the censor and let the regiment have back what you can. So you're going to see the remains of what might have been a much better film if it hadn't been for the censors. It's a story of the 8th Belfast Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment in Burma. The regiment was formed in 1939 in Dunmore Park up the Antrim Road, made up of 1,000 volunteers of young men in their 20s and 30s. We found ourselves in France with the BEF a few months later, in Christmas 1939. During the phony war, we were up and down northern France with our guns, and then, unfortunately, had to come back through Dunkirk, St. Malo and Cherbourg. One of the batteries disobeyed orders, and we were very proud to say brought their guns back. We then trained in England and helped all we could there with the blitzes, and found ourselves going out to the Far East. We didn't know where, but we ended up in India. Early in 1942, we disembarked at Bombay, but because of problems at sea, the guns landed at Karachi, and all came together in the province of Lahore in the Punjab. That meant a drive along the so-called Grand Trunk Road of 1,000 miles through Calcutta into East Bengal. India came as a great shock to us. With its enormous population, its overpowering heat and humidity, and the vast distances to be covered on badly surfaced, dusty roads. We saw a country which in many ways hadn't changed for centuries. It had accepted influences from the Mughals, the Portuguese and the British, but somehow absorbed them all and made them totally Indian. Under the thin veneer of modern civilization in Calcutta lay dreadful poverty and hunger. But many of the people were not fully aware of another danger, which was of a much greater threat to their way of life than the British Empire had ever been. Singapore, Malaya and most of Burma had already fallen to the Japanese, and their army was on the march a mere 200 miles away across the Ganges. Only General Bill Slim's army could now stop their advance across the wide estuary. Soon the muddy banks of the Hooghly River might be the gateway for invasion of all the subcontinent, and even the overworked low-caste Indians repairing its banks were unlikely to welcome this. This river could be dangerous, and as rough at times as the Irish Sea. We had to take our guns and equipment across the numerous branches of the Ganges Delta on very romantic but rather dangerous-looking craft. On the way we passed floating bodies of tragic famine victims cast by their families into the holy waters. Before long, our all-volunteer regiment was approaching the Burmese border to become part of Slim's 14th Army, the Forgotten Army. At first, life here in the Arakan seemed to go on as before, but soon the war became very real again as we came under fire on the road to the south. Ambulances passed frequently, carrying casualties from the front, while abandoned and ruined pagodas showed that the enemy had already passed this way. The villages of Basha bamboo huts were now deserted as we made our way towards the front. One of our greatest problems was the condition of the roads. In spite of some danger to themselves, the remaining local people were prepared to work for a few annas, watering them to strengthen the surface and keep down the dust. This allowed us to travel much faster to and from the front. As we passed the paddy fields and began the climb towards the jungle-covered Mayo Range, we came to the Razable Crossroads, the scene of a very bitter battle the year before, in which many British soldiers were killed. The graveyard on the roadside with its simple white crosses is, more than 50 years later, still well maintained by the British War Graves Commission. After crossing the first Bailey Bridge built in Burma to replace one blown up by the Japanese, our objective was to help secure the road leading to the tunnels through the mountains. So with our vehicles proudly displaying the red hand of Ulster and driven by Belfast men like Sergeant Rowley Sinton, we moved our guns within range. Because the tunnels were surrounded by low hills, it was difficult to get a direct shot into them. The roads were very bad, and some of the West African drivers worse. Accidents and broken down lorries hindered progress. The Japanese still held air supremacy, but the route was partly secured by moving our guns in closer and using them to blast the tops of the nearby hills. This cleared them of trees as well as snipers and allowed our troops to move very carefully along the mountain roads and into the gorge and improve sight lines for the artillery. This could now be used at closer range for bombardment of the area around the tunnel mouth and to help drive back the enemy still occupying the shaft. Control of the two tunnels through the mountain range was essential to stem the invasion from the southeast, but the surrounding mountains were still occupied by a very determined enemy who did not seem to know the meaning of surrender. These tunnels had been originally built by British engineers to enable rice to be shipped to India, but no army could hope to control this part of the country unless it held military supremacy here. The mountain ranges behind Mong Daw ran roughly parallel with the Arakan coast on the Bay of Bengal. Thick jungle grows below the mountains, but our position allowed us to dominate this coastal plain, and the accuracy here of our artillery fire at long distance enemy targets apparently justified our nickname, the 12-mile snipers. On the approach to Buthiddong, we had destroyed a number of strategic Japanese strongpoints, and this was a cause for celebration. We'd come a long way from our initial training on the Antrim road to the jungles of Burma. With our Northern Ireland accents and our close comradeship, we soon became known to the other regiments as Cunningham's Private Army, after our Colonel James Cunningham of Killyleagh. We never forgot, though, that we were all part of Lord Louis Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command. His strategy affected us all, especially that of working in defined territorial admin boxes, in which we would operate with airdrops of supplies even if surrounded by the enemy. One of our units took part in the Battle of the Nakitok Pass, when the guns kept firing until the siege was lifted. Several members of our regiment were decorated for bravery here, including Robin Reid receiving the Military Cross and Bombardier Mills the Military Medal. We were a cheerful lot. Even at times there wasn't much to be cheerful about. Many had known one another before the war, being colleagues from the same offices and organisations such as Gallagher's, the Civil Service, Belfast Corporation and so on. We were later joined by some men from England, Wales and Scotland, but they soon became honorary Ulstermen. On the road south once more, the Burmese had fled, and there was no one to damp down the roads. As well as the difficulty in driving through them, the dust clouds could give away our position to patrolling Japanese aircraft and ground troops. Most of the bridges had been bombed and had to be roughly repaired before heavy equipment could pass over them. The wreckage of lorries destroyed in the explosions made us all doubly careful. Since there were no railways in this area, roads remained the most important strategic targets. Since these roads were our lifeline, it was in everybody's interest to keep them open. But some of the bridges across riverbeds were so badly damaged that speedy repair was impossible. In the dry season they could easily be bypassed, but when the monsoons came, they became